Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning into my stream. My name is Sherry, and today I'm going to be talking about the beginning of the French Revolution up until King Louis's death. So as always, make sure you guys follow at ThinkFiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And we post reminders about upcoming streams and memes that relate to your AP struggles. So today we're going to talk about how France is doing before the revolution, their social system, the kings that helped influence the upcoming revolution, groups within the French Revolution, the causes of the French Revolution, major events in the revolution, and the role of women during this time. So the first thing I'm going to answer is how France is doing. And France is doing great, but it's also not doing great. On the outside, France is it's the peak of culture in Europe, but internally it's suffering a lot of discourse and turmoil because there's a large national debt that keeps on growing, and it's not going to stop because the kings don't know how to save money. France follows this ancient regime that was founded during medieval times, and it's basically a feudal system. So people are stuck in the classes and they can't move. The bourgeoisie, which are part of the third class, the lowest class in this ancient regime, even though they're more wealthy than some of the nobles, they can't move upwards in society. So they're not granted the rights that they would like to have. And the monarchy, like I said earlier, is highly inept and super inefficient. They keep spending money and they don't know how to rule, which leads to a lot of discourse from the people. And contempt for the first and second classes of society is increasing rapidly because of certain short-term factors that I'm going to get into later. So an example of the national debt that kept growing is the Palace of Versailles, built during the reign of Louis XIV. And this cost an extravagant amount of money that was basically funded by the state, and was basically funded by the state, who collected taxes from the lowest class only. So this slide is going to talk about the social classes in the French Revolution. And the first one is the first estate. So obviously by their name, they're like the highest class, basically. The second estate is the second estate, and they mostly consist of nobles. The third estate is basically everyone else, and I'm going to get into what exactly makes up the first, second, and third estate and what makes them different. So on this slide, I'm going to talk about the first estate, and the first estate is basically the clergy. And the clergy is everyone who works for the Catholic Church. So priests, nuns, monks, those type of people are all the clergy. So they all constitute the first estate. And in the clergy, even though they're the first estate, they have a mix between rich and poor. And the rich clergy are usually from noble families, and they enjoyed life in Paris or Versailles, and they were relatively wealthy and had a very relaxed life. And then the lower clergy basically were the people's priests, and their lives are often the same as peasants or even harder than theirs. But the clergy, even though it doesn't matter if they were lower or upper, they all paid almost no taxes to the state, and instead they collected tithes. And tithes are 10%, or a 10% tax that goes to the church to maintain it and to pay for the lands that it's on. And because they were part of the clergy in the church, they own 10% of French land. And the reason why the Catholic Church is so powerful is because Louis XIV had made a deal with them during his time to basically establish more power. And the clergy, they make up 1% to 2% of the total population. So they're not that much, but they own a large amount of French land, which is going to be a problem in the future. So one of the most famous examples of a member of the first estate is the picture of the man in red right there. And this is Cardinal Richelieu, and he helped establish the absolute monarchy that kept going from Louis XIV to Louis XVI up until he was beheaded. So the second estate is a class made up of nobles and aristocrats. And they basically descended from people who had made their money long ago, and it was just constantly old money being passed down. And later on in the revolution, it's going to be old money versus new money. So the nobles versus the bourgeoisie, who are going to rise up as a social class. And the amount of money owned by the nobles varied because some were extremely wealthy, but others were also very, very poor. They didn't have enough money, but they had enough to buy their titles. But they still enjoyed benefits that bourgeoisie, who had more money than them, couldn't enjoy. And the nobles owned 25% of all of France's land. So even though they only made up 1.5 to 2% of France's population, just like the clergy, they owned a significant amount of land due to basically inheriting it over time. And just like the clergy, they didn't have to pay a land tax because during Louis XIV, he established this land tax that was a direct tax on the land you lived on. But only peasants had to pay it. This way, the nobles would support him during his reign. But even though they didn't have to pay the tax, they were still a little resentful of the monarchy because, as we saw earlier in the very nice picture of Versailles, to gain favor with the king, nobles would have to move there. But the problem was that instead of hiring servants, they would still hire servants, but nobles who lived there had to cater to the king. And that meant like helping undress him for bed or do basic menial tasks that usually would be designated for servants, which are part of the third estate. And the second estate was divided into nobility of the sword and nobility of the robe. So nobility of the sword is the more prestigious class, and they gained their titles from being military leaders. So they were considered more prestigious. And the nobility of the robe is basically anyone who got their title from either being in government or basically buying it with the money they had. But you could only buy it if you had enough. And this is a picture of the lavish styles of the nobles of the time and all their lavish spending, which is definitely going to be a problem in the future. And then finally, our last estate is the third estate. So it goes 1, 2, 3. And basically, the third estate is everyone else. So there are 3 distinct groups because everyone else is a very broad population. And our 3 groups are the bourgeoisie, which is the new middle class, basically. They are composed of educated doctors and lawyers and artisans and like well-off merchants who make quite a lot of money. And they're also educated. So they like read up on the ideals of the Enlightenment, which is going to be a very important factor in the upcoming revolution. And then our next group are the city workers. And the city workers are basically people who live in the city, obviously by the name. And they have either really low paying jobs, like they cook and they clean and they're basically servants, but they're paid very poorly, or they're either unemployed in the city. So they live in like places like Paris, where it's very unhealthy, like very filthy and unhealthy. And then our last group are the peasants, which are 80% of the population, not 80% of the third. Yeah, not 80% of the third estate, but they're 80% of the total population. And these peasants are typically work on farms, and they get taxed for working on those farms and growing food. And they're very, very poor. They are the poorest class in France. So for the third estate, while we saw that the first 2 estates didn't get taxed at all because, absolutist monarchy, you have to get the nobles to support you, so you're not going to tax them. The state taxed 50% of the third estate's income. So that 50% was definitely a heavy burden, and it's why so many of them were poor. And it's also why the bourgeoisie were very angry because they had a lot of money, even more than some nobles, but they still couldn't move up. And they didn't have the rights that those nobles who were poorer than them had. So this is going to be an important factor for them wanting to like increase their social standing. And because they taxed 50% of their income, they felt the burden of the increasing national debt because they're the ones who are supporting the country, not the nobles who have a lot of wealth or the clergy who already collects church taxes. So the peasants have church taxes to deal with, and they have land taxes and just basically other taxes that are being put in place. And it's just a strain on their lifestyles. And basically, the third estate is growing increasingly more frustrated at the inequality of this old regime, and they want to change it, but they're going to well, not all of them want to change it. The bourgeoisie want to change it, as I said earlier, due to the inequality of them having a lot of money but not getting the same rights as others. The peasants and city workers aren't educated, so they're not sure how they can change it. But basically, the bourgeoisie are going to influence everyone to start making changes and demanding changes to this old regime. And they had no voice in government, which is going to be one of the major events in the revolution when they finally decide they have a voice. It's and it's a way of like consolidating power for the nobles and the monarchy, because even though they make up a large majority of the population, they're relatively uneducated, and they want to keep it that way so that the government has more power. So this is probably like the most iconic picture for the French Revolution. And on the bottom, it shows basically a third estate worker. Like he's chained up and like restrained by society, and he's basically being ridden like a horse by the second estate, the first estate, and the monarchy. So most iconic picture, and it just shows like the conditions of the third estate at the time. So my first question, because I just put a lot of information about the estates for you guys. Which estate disliked the ancient regime the most? Is it A, the third estate, B, the first estate, C, the second estate, or D, the fourth estate? Can you guys type in chat what answer you think it is? I'll give you guys like a minute for that. Okay, so people already put in the answer, and it's correct. It is A, the third estate, because even though the second estate was displeased with the yes, it's A. Even though the second estate was displeased with the monarchy because they were practically servants, they still enjoyed a lot of luxuries like not being taxed, and they would go to parties that the queen would throw. So the third estate were the ones really breaking their back in this type of situation and economy. So good job to everyone who said A. So now I'm going to talk about the kings and how they influenced basically how they influenced and started this whole revolution, how they're going to be a cause of the revolution. And the three kings that you guys should know about, well, it's more like two, but the three kings you should know about are Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. So it goes great-grandfather, grandfather, and then grandson. And Louis XIV is known as the Sun King. And he's called the Sun King because he believed in the divine right theory, that he was chosen by God to lead. And his most iconic line is that I am the state, which basically like it embodies the absolutism concept. And the people that helped him establish this were Cardinal Richelieu, who was during his when he was young, he helped prepare the throne and weaken the power of the nobles to prepare the throne for to centralize the government more for the young king. And then when he died, Cardinal Mazarin took over, and then Jean-Baptiste Colbert took over. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he wasn't a cardinal, so he wasn't part of the clergy, but he was the financial advisor. So so the concept of mercantilism, he tried putting that into effect for France so that they had a very favorable trade coming into a very favorable trade with other countries. And so, like I said, he establishes an absolute monarchy, calls himself the Sun King, weakens nobles, but also tries to gain their support by not taxing them. And he builds the Palace of Versailles. And the Palace of Versailles is like a beautiful place to live in, like the picture I showed you guys. And it's definitely a luxury because it's outside the city of Paris, where a lot of poor people live. But nobles that live there have to tend to the king, and it was basically a source of embarrassment to tend to the king sometimes, but you had to do it to like garner his favor back then. And Louis XIV aided in starting the national debt because he engaged in many wars, from the Austrian War of Succession to the Spanish War of Succession, where he tried to put his grandson on the throne, and he tried to expand the Bourbon dynasty, which is his family line. But he eventually lost some of them, as we know. And this just caused a huge deficit in the national budget, so he started it. And he also was super into the idea of religious uniformity. So earlier in a previous stream, I talked about the French Wars of Religion and how it ended in the Edict of Nantes. or Nantes, however you guys remember it so that you can spell it correctly. It ended in the Edict of Nantes, and basically that gave Huguenots religious freedom or religious tolerance, but he revoked it because he was a Catholic and he wanted this idea of a religiously united France. So that caused a lot of Huguenots to flee to England. And then once he died, his Louis XV took over, and Louis XV was actually used to be liked by the people. He used to be called Louis the Well-Beloved King by the people when he was young. But as he grew up, he turned the people against the monarchy morally because he had a lot of affairs and the people knew about them. So people no longer saw the monarchy as something to be respected, and their power wasn't really legitimized because they were of such low reputation to the people. So basically, he helped ruin the monarchy's power. And Louis XV had a problem. Just like his predecessor, he loved to spend money. And he damaged France's foreign relations with other countries, which is going to lead to problems during the French Revolution. And then we have his successor, Louis XVI, who's married to the iconic Marie Antoinette, who said the line, "Let them eat cake," which got everyone really angry. And Louis XVI was a very indecisive man who wanted to please everyone, even though that's basically impossible. And he wanted to please all the estates, even though they all had different goals. So Louis XVI helped expand the national debt because he approved the war effort in the American Revolution after they had lost the 7 Years' War. So they had a bunch of debt from the 7 Years' War, and then he wants to help in the American Revolution, which leads to more debt because money is needed to fight in wars and supply weapons and men. So basically, he aided in ruining the economy with his decisions and parties, and his lack of a strong will basically allowed the Third Estate to walk all over him during the revolution, and it would eventually end in his death. So now I'm going to talk about the different groups that emerged due to the French Revolution. And first we have the émigrés, and they're basically the aristocratic nobles. And some of them support change, but they're on the conservative side of the French Revolution spectrum politically. So they want to see reform, or some of them don't want to see reform, but they want to see a little bit to no reform. And they want the monarchy to stay in power, but they see that the lower estate should be granted rights and other benefits. But near the radical stage of the revolution, they're going to flee France because they're going to start fearing for their lives. And a lot of them are aristocrats who are fleeing France and being a part of this party. And then we have the moderates who want to see the crown dethroned, but they don't want to see the radical chopping off head stage because they believe that the monarchy can be a symbol, kind of like in England. And then the last group is the Jacobins and the sans-culottes. And sans-culottes literally translates to without breeches. So if you've seen culottes, they're very wide leg pants. And back then they were silk and just a status of being very rich and powerful and wealthy. So the sans-culottes were poor Third Estate workers or city workers who basically don't wear culottes, and they instead wore trousers. And they're part of the radical political party along with the Jacobins who want to see the king dead and all that good stuff. But the difference between them is that sans-culottes are city workers and Jacobins are typically bourgeoisie and educated. Oh, and the sans-culottes were also manipulated by the Jacobins at times. So some causes of the French Revolution, which I've gone over earlier, but we're going to get, these aren't, so there are two different ways you can call the causes of the French Revolution. There's some like the storming of the Bastille, which is an actual event, but I'm just going to talk about past events that don't affect France at the moment. So the American Revolution is definitely a cause of the French Revolution, as is economic troubles, which have been troubling France for years. The lack of opportunity to improve one's social status is a problem due to the ancient regime, which is a feudal system from medieval times. and the inability to reform or the inability to change government and how it like runs the people. So the problem with the American Revolution is that it shows that Enlightenment ideas worked, because when the Americans fought against England, they believed in democracy and liberty, and America wasn't expected to win, but they did. So it showed that those ideas that they took into battle with them actually had real life applications and were just things that people could write about and preach. And then for economic troubles, basically there was more debt and less food because the wealthy enjoyed a lavish lifestyle and they never had to go hungry, but the national debt fell on the third estate to pay off. And this economic troubles and this debt became more exacerbated when bad weather conditions affected a harvest one year, the year of the French Revolution, and it ruined grain. It ruined grain harvest, and grain is basically what the peasants survived off of back then. So without grain, they're all going to starve to death because the less grain there is, the more the prices rise, and the peasants are poor because they have to pay all the taxes. So when they can't buy bread for themselves, their families are going to starve, and this is going to be a short-term cause, an immediate cause of the French Revolution. And then the third cause is the lack of opportunity to improve one's social status. And like I said earlier, the bourgeoisie, they can't move up in society despite having more money than some nobles even. And they're incredibly frustrated at the ancient regime because they can't move up. So the bourgeoisie, because they're educated and they have jobs like being doctors and lawyers, and they're wealthy merchants who can like read. They've read all the Enlightenment deals from people like John Locke and Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and those types of people. And they start spreading those ideas throughout the cities. They're the ones who actually inspire the peasants and city workers to rise up, because they start talking about ideas of representing themselves, and they give examples of it working in America. So the Enlightenment ideas are spread because of the bourgeoisie. And then finally, the inability to reform any type of government is like an immediate factor also, because the third estate, there is a meeting called the Estates General, which the king calls like almost never, but when he calls it, every estate sends its representatives and they all get one vote each. So this meant that the third estate was always unable to reform government because their goals are always different to the goals of the their goals are always different than the goals of the first and second estates, who wanted to maintain power and no taxes. So they couldn't reform government ever, despite being like 98% of the population and owning a majority of the land and paying most of the taxes. And this is going to be a really big problem. So here's a question so that you guys have time to process what I just told you. Which was a group involved in the French Revolution? Was it the émigrés, Jacobins, or the sans-culottes, or is it all of the above? I'll give you guys like a minute to answer that, 30 seconds to a minute to answer that. Okay, so the answer is D. Good job to everyone who put that in the chat. And it is all of the above. Like I said, the émigrés were the conservative party, while the Jacobins and the sans-culottes were the radical party that would basically inspire the use of the guillotine and all the head chopping during this revolution. So now I'm going to talk about major events in the French Revolution from 1789, in the year 1789. And this includes events that most people consider the start of the revolution. So start of the revolution or causes of the revolution. And the first event is the Estates General. So King Louis XVI has a problem, and this problem is that he spent so much money that the bank won't lend him anymore because he'll never pay it back, and they know that. And guess who runs the banks? The bourgeoisie. So because they know that he's never going to pay them back, they stop lending him money. And this is a problem because France is in a major crisis and they're in debt. and they don't know what to do. So how is King Louis XVI going to solve this problem? Well, he's going to call an Estates General. And the Estates General is a meeting of all three estates to discuss a large national problem and then vote on it to make reforms to society or the government. And he basically calls them to discuss the large national debt that him and his predecessors caused and how they should fix it. So the Estates General works like this. Every estate sends their representatives a group, and those representatives get to decide on what they think their estate would agree on, and they all have to come to a decision that is agreeable because they only get one vote. So if you can see the problem with this, there are three estates, which means there's never going to be a tie. And the first and second estates are bathing in wealth. They are ridiculously wealthy and enjoy so many benefits that the third estate never has. So the king comes up with a proposal or a solution, and his solution is to start taxing the upper estates, so the first and second estate, because they pay almost nothing to the government. And this seems like a great thing for the third estate. So the third estate obviously agrees. They don't have to pay all of their income to the government, to the state. The first and second estates will do that for them. But it doesn't really work out because the first and second estates are so used to not paying taxes. Why would you want to get taxed now, even if it's for the good of your country? So they obviously vote no, and the third estate gets outvoted despite being 98% of the population. So this is a repeating pattern through history, and this last Estates General is just going to be the tipping point, basically. And it's going to lead to the tennis court oath. So the third estate is so angry that their vote was, that they were basically voted against, and how unfair the Estates General is, that they're going to walk out. And the king does something very rude, and he locks the doors of the assembly room so that they can't get back in. So the third estate is like, okay, we'll just fix this. And they decide to go to an inside tennis court. Yes, an inside tennis court, because the king is very lavish and likes playing tennis indoors. And they swear to stay in that room until they make a constitution that represents the people and gives them rights. So this is the tennis court oath. And yeah, this tennis court oath leads to the creation of the National Assembly. So when they create a constitution, they decide that instead of being in the government that Louis XVI wants, they're going to create their own government that they believe represents the people. And this is going to be called the National Assembly. And it's recognized by the king as a legitimate government after a while because, the third estate is 98% of the population. And if they keep wanting you to acknowledge it, you're going to acknowledge it because you're fearful for your crown. And the National Assembly did some really good things like abolishing feudalism. And they're basically going to weaken the power of the king over time because they're going to create laws that the king, who is very indecisive and weak-minded, he's going to accept. So this is a picture of the tennis court oath. And as you can see, it's a lot of people. The picture's a little blurry, but there's basically a lot of people in that one room, which just goes to show you how large the third estate is and how much they want their rights. And they just locked themselves inside until they could come up with a constitution. So after this tennis court oath and National Assembly and constitution is made, then there's more events in 1789, and then it goes through 1791 because that's the year the king is beheaded. But the first event after the National Assembly is founded is the storming of the Bastille. And the Bastille is basically a large fortress that was made during the 100 Years' War to protect Paris. But by the time of the French Revolution, and the 100 Years' War was during the 1300s, so medieval times. But during the French Revolution, it basically comes to stand for the king's absolutist rule and his dictatorial power. So the people decide to storm it because they're civil. Well, they don't decide this. They decide to storm it for weapons after they hear that the king is bringing in mercenaries. And there's a rumor about these mercenaries that the king is planning to put down the National Assembly, who has a National Guard to protect them, that they're planning to put down the National Assembly. And it starts a bunch of fear and gossip. And because the people are so angry at the thought of this without trying to hear the facts, and there's just a lot of hysteria around it, they decide to storm the Bastille for weapons and gunpowder. So they storm the prison, and well, they're on their way to storm the prison, and there are guards there, even though it's not, there's not really anyone in there. It's just like a symbol. There are still guards there, and the problem with those guards is that they're also members of the Third Estate, so they're not getting fed, so they're also hungry and starving. So they decide to, a lot of them desert their posts and join the Third Estate in their storming of the Bastille. And basically, the storming is a success. The people show that they're no longer afraid of being oppressed, and that they're going to fight for their rights. And it ends with the warden of the prison getting his head on a spike and a few of his other guards getting killed, which is just like the first sign of violence in the French Revolution. So it's already a really bad sign that there's violence of this type. And then afterwards, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is created in 1789. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is basically the French version of the Declaration of Independence. They even had Thomas Jefferson advise them on it. So it listed the rights of the people, the French people as a whole, and it basically inspired the ideals and the slogan of the French Revolution, which is liberté, equalité, and fraternité. It was written by Marquis de Lafayette and Abe Size. And if you remember the Marquis de Lafayette, he was very prevalent in the the American Revolution, because he helped, he was a good friend of George Washington and helped the Americans before the king signed an alliance with them to officially help them in the war. So he's the Marquis de Lafayette. When he dies, he's going to be considered a hero of two worlds. So the United States and the French, the United States and France. He's going to be considered a hero in both parts. So he helps to write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And then 2 years later, the Legislative Assembly is formed. So the Legislative Assembly basically disbands the National Assembly, because the National Assembly writes a constitution that creates a constitutional monarchy. And the constitutional monarchy weakened the power of the king and basically took almost all his power away. He was a figurehead like the monarchs are in England. And this constitution, the king has to approve it because he wants to please them, and they could basically throw him in jail anytime now because of their their power and the support that the people have for them. And like I said, when it gets approved, it forms a Legislative Assembly, which replaces the National Assembly, because the Legislative Assembly has a lot more power than the National Assembly, because they become the primary government of the time. And the Legislative Assembly gives the bourgeoisie a lot of benefits. It allows them to take up jobs in government and local towns and cities that weren't available to them before. And it abolishes the noble class. So the nobility, there's no more second estate. The nobility are on the same level as the bourgeoisie. But the Legislative Assembly made a very bad move, because they created a civic constitution. I believe that's the name. They created a civic constitution, and they gave it to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is such an ingrained part in people's lives in France due to Louis XIV, that when the church believes it to be not sinful, but they don't believe it's right, and they don't want a lot of their priests to sign it, this makes the Catholic Church a very open opponent of the French Revolution. And it's such an important role in people's lives that it gave opponents of the French Revolution a strong base to oppose the revolution and its ideals. because the Catholic Church was backing that opposition. There would be more opposition from outside countries because the American Revolution was revolutionary, literally and also figuratively, because no other country in the world had ever decided in a democracy. And when it spreads to France, people, rulers in other countries like Prussia and Austria are afraid it's going to spread to their countries and that there's going to be a revolution that's going to be as violent as this one. So they make enemies with outside countries because no one wants to lose their power in Europe. And then after the Women's Bread March, which I'm going to get into after this next slide, there's the flight to Versailles, I believe, or Rennes. I can't pronounce French, obviously. But this is in 1791, and the monarchs are absolutely terrified of all the turmoil that's going on. There's a lot of violence, and basically they're in fear of they're fearful for their lives, obviously. Like the storming of the Bastille was the first sign of violence, but this will be the next. Well, it's the first sign of violence in in one of the bloodiest revolutions. But it's called the flight because the monarchs are so scared that they try fleeing France. And they're in this hidden carriage, but they're caught. And they're caught at Versailles, and they're sent back to Paris. And you might be wondering why they're in Paris, because didn't they live in Versailles with all the nobles taking care of them? Yes, they did live in Versailles, but the Women's March on Versailles is going to change that, and I'm going to go over what that is right now. And also the flight is basically, it ruined any hope of reconciling the monarch's relationship with the people, because why are they fleeing, right? And the people got really angry at this, so they basically tossed them back in Paris. So the picture underneath is a picture of the Women's March on Versailles, and it looks very violent. If you can see what they're holding, it's a bunch of pitchforks and torches, and basically the women are going to demand bread for their families. So this slide is all about the role that women had on the French Revolution, and they had two major events that are basically really important for them, and it's the Women's March on Versailles, which is also known as the Bread March, or March for Bread or whatever, because they march for bread, and the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen. And that sounds like the declarations of the rights of man and the citizen, but there's a difference that I'm going to get into. So the Women's March on Versailles happens, it happens after the Legislative Assembly, but not after legislation. It happens after the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, but before the Legislative Assembly and the flight. So basically the women are angry and they want bread for their families. The people are starving. There's a thing known as the Great Fear, where there's basically anarchy in the countryside because people can't feed their families. And, they just can't feed their families, and people are actually starving in the cities. And, the let them eat cake line didn't help either. So the peasants and the third estate is frustrated, angry, they're starving, all bad things for the first two estates. So the women wanting to feed their families, but they can't because they're poor. And bread inflation prices were more than 100% due to how bad the harvest was that year, and the national debt, that they decide to head to the Palace of Versailles and demand the monarchs move to Paris. And they demand the monarchs move to Paris because Paris is the epicenter of the French Revolution, and the French Revolution is just a mess at this point. Sorry, it's just a mess at this point, and Paris is basically suffering the most because it's supposed to be the capital of France, so why aren't the monarchs there? That's basically the reasoning. And when the Versailles is outside of Paris, it's a long walk away, but it's only a few miles away, but it's miles are a lot if you're walking. So they march on Versailles because they demand that the monarchs, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and their child, come out and see basically how horrible the peasants' lives are in Paris, because they're on outside in Versailles. Versailles is beautiful. There's not that much turmoil. But in Paris, like, the revolution is going on, and they need to see how bad the city is so that they can try to provide a solution for this, basically. So they practically kidnap the king and the queen, and they haul them back to Paris. And yeah, they haul them back to Paris, and the king and queen are basically forced to be in the midst of a very violent revolution. So the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Female Citizen is basically the counterpart to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. And it was penned by Olympe de Gouges. And Olympe de Gouges was an educated woman, obviously. She was from the second estate, the noble class. And she felt that the rights of men didn't apply to women, and she argued that they deserved the same rights. And she also made arguments such as marriage. When her husband died, she didn't want to marry again because she felt that men had a choice while women were forced into it. And she edited the Declaration of the Rights of Women she edited the Declaration of the Rights of Men to include the word women in it, and also to change things that she felt didn't apply to women or were unjust to them. But sadly, she's going to die due to opposing the execution of the king, because she's one of those people who isn't as radical as the Jacobins, but she's also, she wants change, but she's not as radical as the Jacobins, so she doesn't see the need to kill the king. And she's going to die despite writing this Declaration of the Rights of Women. So my question for you guys is, which of these was not an event in the beginning of the French Revolution? Was it the Women's March on Versailles, the Estates General, King Louis XVI being executed, or the storming of the Bastille? Yes, it is C. Good job, Mr. Beckman. So it is C. Yes. So the King Louis XVI is not going to get executed until later in the year of 1791. Oh, well, yes, the answer is C. And he's not going to get executed till 1791. And I'm going to go over the 2018 SAQ because it was on the AP Euro test. So let me share that screen. So in 2018, this is the SAQ, and it talks about the French Revolution. And you don't really need to know the second part of the French Revolution for it, but it's the first part of the French Revolution. So I'm going to go through parts A, B, and C with you guys, and then I'll see what your responses are. So I'm going to read the passage, and it basically says, at the end of the 1700s, two great revolutionary forces enormously increased the intensity of events. The two forces were these. On one hand, the French nation had reached intellectual maturity, and on the other, the French bourgeoisie had reached social maturity. French thought desired to apply its methods of analysis and deduction to all of reality, to society, as well as nature. The French bourgeoisie had become conscious of its power, its wealth, its rights, and of its near infinite possibilities of development. In a word, the bourgeoisie had attained class consciousness. So this is from a French politician who published this between 1901 and 1904. And we're going to start with part A. So describe one prior intellectual change that influenced the events described in the passage. What would you guys say, based off the passage, is one prior intellectual change like that influenced the events he's describing? So yes, Mr. Beckman, I would say it was the Enlightenment, because it talks about the French nation reaching intellectual maturity and about applying methods of analysis and deduction to all of reality, to society, and as well as nature. So, and it also says the French bourgeoisie becomes like conscious of their power and their rights. And those were all major concepts during the Enlightenment, which like forced people to think for themselves and focus on their rights, like they had rights as human beings that were bestowed upon them by God. So definitely the Enlightenment helped influence the events that the French politician is describing in the passage. So for part B, it says, explain why the pattern of social changes that the author describes, because I can't pronounce the name, describes how it led to the French Revolution. Explain why. So basically, the pattern of social changes are intellectual maturity and social maturity. And how do those basically, how do the French bourgeoisie becoming conscious of their power, wealth, and rights, and near infinite possibilities of development lead to the French Revolution? So what I put was that the bourgeoisie basically become richer through the Industrial Revolution, and that basically like it catalyzed their social class into being extremely wealthy, because remember, they're merchants and doctors and lawyers who are educated. So because they rival the nobles in wealth, it basically disrupted the old social order and the third estate. So that definitely ruined their the social or the ancient regime of the time. And that's why it led to the French Revolution, because the bourgeoisie really want to have the rights that the nobles have, but because of this old like caste system that they can't move upwards in society in, it leads to the French Revolution. And then the last question is, explain how an ideology of the 1800s influenced the author's interpretation of the causes of the French Revolution. And since we used the Enlightenment earlier, I definitely don't recommend reusing it for part C. So maybe another cause would be good. Okay, so I said that it came from the Enlightenment, yes, but also the scientific revolution, because it says applied methods of analysis and deduction to reality. So basically thinking for yourself and using science instead of believing what tradition tells you, which is why he interprets the causes of the revolution as this. So that was the SAQ for 2018. It was the first one, I believe. Yeah, it was the first SAQ for 2018. And it basically shows how important the French Revolution is, because in 2019, the AP test I took, the second SAQ also sort of related to the French Revolution, which is why it's really important to know all the individual events and stuff. Okay, well, if there are no questions, then thank you guys so much for tuning into my stream. I hope you learned a lot about the the French Revolution, and basically what spurred the people to basically start a revolution. So in summary, it was the economic troubles of the time. So in summary, it was a mix of like long-term and short-term causes. And long-term causes include economic troubles that span 3 kings, 3 monarchs, as well as like basically the political inadequacy of the monarchs, and how how like inefficient they were at ruling France, and how hungry to join wars they were basically. And short-term causes are definitely like the horrible like harvest of the French Revolution, the year that it took place, the horrible harvest, because it just exacerbated economic troubles, and like it made the peasants desperate. And the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, like King Louis the 16th, Louis the 16th was definitely a tool, Mr. Beckman. He basically agreed to everyone's whims for no reason, because he wants to please everyone, and you can't do that, especially if you're the monarch, because you're ruling over a country with like 1 million people in it. So definitely that. And also another short-term effect is the Enlightenment. Louis XVI definitely didn't see how helping the Americans win the war just to get back at England would affect him and basically ruin his, like actually kill him in a sense. And this French Revolution is going to be probably the bloodiest revolution in history, and it's going to cause a lot of fear near the end of it once we get past the death of the king and the rise of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna. So I hope you guys get to there in class. And you're going to see a lot of countries trying to oppose France. So because they're so afraid that revolution is going to spread to their countries, because the Enlightenment ideas of the people ruling themselves and the government having the consent of the governed instead of divine right theory is just so new at the time. Even though the Enlightenment was like a few decades ago, it's still really new. So yeah, the French Revolution is going to have a lot of effects in Europe, and it's definitely going to upheave the old way of life and the old balance of power. So, as always, thank you guys so much for coming to my stream and listening to me ramble about the French Revolution and whatever I'm teaching. And I hope you learned a lot. Thank you.